Today's edition of the Beef Roundtable will focus on the topic of value-added replacement heifers. Welcome to this edition of the Beef Roundtable. I'm Dr. Ron Lemonager, Beef Extension Specialist at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana. The Beef Roundtable is available as a video at both the Beef Magazine and www.beefroundtable.com websites, as well as a downloadable MP3 at beefroundtable.com.
And I'm Bert Rutherford, Senior Editor of Beef Magazine from Amarillo, Texas. Our first guest is Dr. Glenn Rogers. Glenn is a beef veterinarian with over 32 years' experience in supporting cattle health and well-being in clinical practice, as well as teaching, research, and technical service. He's also a fifth-generation ranching Texan, where he manages a beef heifer development business and a cow-calf operation. Glenn, tell us a little bit about your outfit and what you do there.
Well, thank you, Bert. We're primarily in the heifer development business. We actually no longer have a cow operation. We made the decision a couple of years ago to move into 100% heifer development. I first started developing heifers back in the 80s. We had a much smaller operation at that time. I was in practice, and we developed some small groups of heifers that we had raised, and that business grew, and then we began to purchase some heifers. I was out of state for a number of years while I was in academia, and I had a lot of time during that time period to pontificate, if you will, about what I really wanted to do to make my ranch sustainable once I got back into it or was able to actually ranch full time like I'm doing now. And during that time period, I analyzed quite a few different enterprises that were associated with the ranch, and the heifer development business just seemed to fit my skill set, my interests more than any other aspect. I like the margin opportunity of the stocker business, and I like the reproductive side of the cow-calf business, and heifer development provides both of those. It also fits our range management goals here on the ranch. We've been doing quite a bit of brush work, grubbing and raking mesquite, and clearing juniper, which we call cedar, and so there's a fair bit of range reseeding and deferment and rotational grazing that we're doing, and it's just much easier to manage those changes with yearlings in the form of heifers than it would be with cows and calves. One other aspect is we have a hunting operation, and through our heifer development program, where we primarily in winter, are on winter wheat, we can move those heifers out of where the deer hunting is going on, and that helps too. So in just about every aspect you look at, it just fits our environmental goals on the ranch, our range management goals, and our goals hopefully for more profitability.
Our second guest is Dr. Dave Patterson. Dr. Patterson is a beef extension specialist at the University of Missouri, specializing in reproductive management of the cow herd, and he also serves as a statewide coordinator for the Show Me Select Replacement Heifer Program. Dave, tell us a little bit about the background that you've got and why the Show Me Select Heifer Program was started.
Well, again, thanks for the invitation to participate in the roundtable. I actually had served on the faculty at the University of Kentucky for about 8 years before I joined the faculty here at MU. And while I was in Kentucky, we began a program that basically Show Me Select was more or less patterned after. The impetus from it came from back in the 90s when we began the program in Kentucky with the goals of trying to increase early conception or pregnancy of heifers, yearling heifers during their first breeding season, minimize the incidence and severity of calving problems during that first calving period, and then improve reproductive outcomes relative to those first calf 2-year-olds. So essentially, leading up to that time, there had been a fair bit of work done over the years in terms of various considerations in terms of nutritional development, reproductive and genetic considerations, as well as health, that more or less were pieces of a puzzle to put together relative to management and development of replacement heifers. So when I was in Kentucky, a group of us more crafted the plan relative to what now has become Show Me Select. And when I came to Missouri, basically the idea behind it was to take that program and essentially grow it to a statewide program. The plan relative to Show Me Select was really more or less 5 points. First, to create an understanding of heifer development based on reproductive outcomes. Secondly, that over time, what you begin to see is the changes in heifer development begin to spill over to the cow herd. And relative to that, the third point is the importance of reproductive management becomes more or less apparent or obvious. And from that point, then number 4, the focus tends to expand to genetic improvement. And from that point, then you get to the 5th consideration, which is you've created a value-added product that requires really sort of a reevaluation of how you actually market those cattle. That's what we've seen in Missouri since we began the program. We've had a significant number of farms now statewide participate in the program. We do have a statewide database, and we'll probably get into a little bit more of a discussion of that later on, but that's essentially the skeleton in terms of how the program began and how it continues to this day.
Glenn, your outfit, the Holt River Ranch, is a little bit different since it's not a statewide program like the Show Me Select. How do you source your heifers, and what guidelines do you follow that ultimately lead to creating that value-added female?
Well, we source our heifers from a variety of methods. I mean, ideally, I would have a large enough cow herd to provide all the heifers that I needed for this program, and that we don't have enough space to do that. So I had to make a decision at some point, I think, whether to just try to do both, do cow-calf program plus heifer development, or just focus just on heifers, which I've done. So I have to purchase those heifers, and we source those heifers from a variety of sources. Many of those are ranches that we've bought heifers from for a number of years, some 5 or 6 years in a row, and that's what we like to do. Unfortunately, we just haven't been able to find enough of those operations yet. We're primarily red Angus, and there are not a lot of truckload quantities of commercial red Angus heifers available in our area, so we've had to source those as far away as Wyoming and Montana in the past. Over the years, we've been able to source those closer to home. Now we actually sourced several loads in Texas and Oklahoma this year, so we're trying to get those sources closer, but it's primarily just through networking and past customers that we dealt with. We do buy some through Superior Livestock. I have some Superior reps that I've developed relationships with over the years. I have a lot of confidence in what they tell me, and they know what I'm looking for, and so we've done some of that. But that's primarily the way we source heifers. Is we're constantly looking. One of the issues, though, is we may find the heifers that are just what we want, but we can't make it work economically. So, that's I'm in the margin business. Quality is very important to us, but it can be really good quality, and we don't see potential to make profit, and that won't work in our situation. So that's maybe one of the differences that we have is that we have to just make sure we source load lots of quality heifers at a price we can afford.
Dave, how does the value-added thing work, in your opinion, with the Show Me Select? Are those cattle valued different by the buyers than compared to buying a heifer maybe at the sale barn or maybe from a neighbor?
Yeah, I'd say in our program, to begin with, we began the program in '97, and since that time we've had over 800 farms participate in the program, and these are statistics that are updated through December 31st of last year, 2015. But we've had about 270 veterinarians statewide participate in the program, about 123,000 heifers enrolled in the program. The vast majority of those heifers are actually raised and developed on the participating farms. Now, that's not to say that we don't have heifers that are purchased in. We have several larger consignments or groups of heifers that are purchased. In many cases, those are repeat purchases in terms of weaned heifer calves from specific locations, either here in Missouri or surrounding states. And one of the big considerations here in Missouri, obviously, is the concerns related to bringing cattle in from outside the fescue belt into the fescue belt. But I guess in terms of how the heifers are marketed, basically the whole idea is that the program essentially starts at weaning. And so all the heifers are enrolled essentially shortly after that time. And then it's a series of steps of which we actually track data on the heifers. All that data is reported and collected through our database. And then all of that is actually available in most respects relative to the cattle that are presented at the time of sale. Most of the heifers go through that are being offered for sale go through our standalone sales that are organized at geographically around the state. However, now we've got several larger consignments of heifers that are having standalone Show Me Select sales, which those to date have been extremely successful as well. If you look at some of the statistics relative to the heifers that are being sold, as an example, we've to date had this is up through January or December of last year, and we just finished our spring sales season, so we've had 4 sales this past spring, selling fall calving heifers. But as of the summer, or for the summer statistics up through last fall, we'd had 141 sales at 10 locations. Of the 123,000 heifers that had sold or had been enrolled in the program, we'd sold actually about 31,000 heifers through the program, and that's more or less the idea relative to the program in general. Is that the vast majority of those heifers would stay on the respective farms and ranches. We've had, in terms of gross sales, close to $43 million in gross sales. We track buyers, and we've had close to 10,000 buyers attend our sales from various states, and actually we've sold heifers now to 19 different states. But we can talk more in a little bit relative to some of the things that we do in terms of the program that I think have led to the marketing success of it. And the thing about it is, in terms of the program itself, we continue to have new producers enrolling heifers in the program, and there is a bit of a learning curve there relative to, the types of heifers that come into the program, how those heifers are developed, bred, and marketed, and the value of those heifers based on the genetic information that we have on them. But, it's sort of, again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, putting pieces together in a puzzle that really adds up to, for some of these fellows that have been in the program ever since its inception. And the first sales here in Missouri with Show Me Select were in the fall of 1997. And since that time, some of the folks that have been enrolled in the program ever since the program began have been very good students of the program in terms of especially the marketing aspect of it. And for that reason, it's become in many cases an entirely new enterprise for them.
So what are your guidelines that you follow in the 2 different programs? Dave, start with what do you require of those producers that are potentially consigning heifers to these sales? And what's adding value? What are the pieces that add value?
Well, the first thing is, we work very closely with our College of Veterinary Medicine, and honestly, we could not do the program without the support of our vet school, our practicing veterinarians across the state, as well as our regional extension livestock specialists and the coordinators in the various regions around the state. We do have 8 regions, and so each one of those regions has a coordinator. Essentially, the first consideration relates to laying a health platform down relative to those heifers in general, and that begins at weaning time. It is a standardized protocol relative to input from our state extension veterinarians as well as practicing veterinarians in the program that are very actively involved with the program. There's no rigid guidelines in terms of nutritional development, but the recommendation is to try to get the heifers developed to roughly 60 to 65% of their projected mature weight. In some cases, as new producers enroll in the program, that takes a bit of time to help them understand the significance of that. Recalling when we began the program, a lot of producers' ideas of good heifer development when it came to nutrition was inadequate in many respects, and I think some of the things that are built into the program in terms of evaluations really have helped them understand that. From the standpoint of intervention, the first point, obviously after weaning, then is all the heifers in our program go through a pre-breeding exam. Those exams are scheduled roughly a month to 6 weeks before the breeding season actually begins, and at that time, all that data begins feeding into a centralized database. So what that includes is pre-breeding weights on the heifers at the time that exam is done. The pre-breeding vaccinations are done. In most cases at that time, all the heifers go through a pre-breeding reproductive evaluation and are assigned reproductive tract scores from 1 to 5, 1 being infantile, 2s and 3s non-cycling, and 4s and 5s cycling. To break that down, the way we define it too, first of all, 1 would be considered to be an infantile tract on those heifers, and essentially the majority of those heifers now are sold at that time and not exposed for breeding based on the poor reproductive performance of those heifers. 2s we consider to be greater than a month away from reaching puberty or onset of cyclicity. 3s would be within a month, and then 4s and 5s we consider to be cycling. 4s in the follicular phase of their estrous cycle, and 5s in the luteal phase. In addition to that, the heifers all go through a pelvic exam. We do not report that data to the public at the time of sale. We use it as a screening tool and not as a selection tool, because I think the perception in many cases is still the bigger the better, and that's not the idea behind it. The whole idea is that the heifers meet minimums. That minimum at that pre-breeding exam is 150 square centimeters. If those heifers don't meet that measurement, then they're flagged in their database and they have to be remeasured at the first preg check. And the first preg check has to be performed within 90 days at the start of the breeding season. We use BIF guidelines to more or less recommend average daily growth in terms of pelvic growth. And based on those recommendations, then at that first preg check, those heifers have to measure 180 square centimeters, or else they are not eligible for sale. That then leads to the next consideration. In most respects now, the vast majority of our heifers in the program are being synchronized and AI'd. 90%, a little over 90% of the heifers last year in 2015 actually went through a synchronization and AI program, and the vast majority of those heifers are being appointment bred. The other point that I would make relative to the synchronization programs is the majority of those heifers, we've been tracking all of that data since 2010, and what's occurring here in Missouri is that the vast majority of those heifers are going on the 14-day cedar. And as a result of that, veterinarians are becoming much more involved in a very proactive way, not only in terms of health and screening of these heifers from a reproductive standpoint, but many of our veterinary practices are becoming much more involved in terms of the overall reproductive management plan, in terms of scheduling the synchronization system or protocol, and in many cases also conducting or performing the AI programs on those heifers. That then is followed by a preg check within 90 days of the start of the breeding season. I think 85% of the heifers last year were actually preg checked by ultrasound. That continues to increase. Many of those heifers are actually, or pregnancies are being fetal sexed, and that information is offered at the time of sale. The reason why we've seen such significant growth across the state relative to ultrasound versus palpation is simply due to accuracy. We track accuracy in terms of the vets across the state from our heifers that sell based on buyer surveys, and that's one of the first questions that it is asked, because at the time of sale, the heifers are grouped by pregnancy. That's the first consideration. And in many cases now, those heifers are being sold in synchronized AI lots, as well as in some situations now also fetal sex lots. And we get the feedback from buyers as to, did those heifers calve when they were projected to calve? And so we on average see significant premiums for heifers carrying AI sired pregnancies versus natural service. And so it all boils down to economics in terms of the importance and accuracy of that preg check. The heifers then go through another preg check. In many cases, the heifers will actually go through 3 preg checks, but at minimum 2. That last preg check occurs roughly 30 days before the sale to confirm pregnancy status. And then there's some booster vaccinations that are administered at that time. At the time of sale, then essentially all the heifers are organized or sorted into lots. We do not do any gate cuts, so a group of heifers that comes into the ring at a specific, sale order, basically all those heifers will sell as a particular lot. But again, the first consideration in terms of sale is pregnancy status. They have to, at minimum, be bred to calve within a 45-day period of one another. But the majority of the heifers now are being grouped into synchronized AI lots, and then the natural service bred heifers are grouped according to the 45-day time recommendation. So that's more or less kind of a sketch of what's involved in terms of the steps. To back up just a bit, one of the things that we added several years ago that actually came from some of the work that we've been involved with one of our USDA integrated grants was USDA initiated their integrated grants program in reproduction a number of years ago. And the way those grants are structured, they have a research component as well as extension and education components. So one of the things that we did relative to that particular project was because of the success rate that we're seeing in terms of timed AI programs in cows, we did field demonstrations more or less scheduled around the state over basically several years, where we inseminated a little over 7,000 cows on 70 different operations across the state, actually 73. And time bred those females on those various farms and ranches. The timed AI pregnancy rate for those 7,000 plus cows was 62%. And what that did was more or less a light bulb came on from the standpoint of, hey, we're creating a lot of half-sisters here out of superior AI sires. And so working with American Angus Association, because a lot of the heifers in the program are Angus sired, we created what we call now Tier 2 in the program. So heifers actually are distinguished at the time of sale from those that meet the minimum requirements for Show Me Select versus those that are sired out of high accuracy proven AI sires. The traits under consideration relative to qualifying heifers based on Tier 2 would be calving ease direct, calving ease maternal, weaning weight, carcass weight, and marbling. And if sires meet the minimum accuracies at the time of the sale of those heifers, then those heifers are distinguished with the Tier 2 tag. The other thing more recently that's been added to the program, Dr. Jared Decker here in our beef extension group, working with the program very closely now, has created, with the support of our heifer board, so to speak, a further distinction for heifers that are actually being DNA profiled. And so those heifers are being referred to as Show Me Plus. But if you break it down and look at those numbers, and we can talk about that here in a while, there's distinct premiums that we're seeing for heifers based on those genetic criteria. We do have rigid requirements relative to the calving ease direct EPDs of the bulls that are used artificially, or naturally in the program, and for bulls that are being used in terms of AI sires for calving ease direct, they have to meet a minimum accuracy of 0.6 relative to use in the program.
Glenn, describe kind of how your program differs, and what guidelines do you follow that adds the value?
Well, thank you. First, I want to applaud Dave for the Missouri Show Me program. It's the Cadillac. It's the gold standard, if you will, in the industry. And I certainly follow what he's doing and try to emulate as much as I can. I think when you get away from the standard program and you get to an individual such as myself, we sold about 800 bred heifers last year, so we're kind of a medium-sized ranching operation. There's a lot of variability out there. The term value added, maybe when you get outside of the Show Me Select, the standard program, the word value added can be very vague. And I think it's important that you know what value added means depending on the individual that is developing the heifers. Probably a more appropriate term than value added would be a reduced risk heifer. And that's what we're striving to reduce risk and increase predictability. And by reducing risk, I mean reducing risk from dystocia, reducing risk from mismating, reducing the risk of longer calving seasons, reducing the risk of reproductive disease being introduced to a herd, reducing issues with disposition just from the way cattle are selected from a disposition standpoint, the way they're handled. What we do with our program, basically, we purchase heifers, as I mentioned earlier, so they're all purchased. The majority of those will be VAC 45 calves. We keep them isolated for another 30 to 45 days so we can limit co-mingling when we bring different truckloads in. We generally do very little to those heifers on arrival from a vaccination standpoint if I'm comfortable with the source and their program. But we try to have the heifers at a minimum. We have them just walk through our facility without doing anything the first time. And as far as our pre-breeding program, we have a pre-breeding vaccination program that includes modified live IBR, BVD, lepto, Vibrio. We do reproductive tract scores, pelvic measurements. As Dr. Patterson mentioned, the pelvic measurement score is really more of an outlier identification tool rather than a strict culling tool. We can identify some outliers, but I think there's danger in putting too much emphasis on the pelvic measurements. We have a almost 100% AI program. It's fixed time AI. We're currently using the 14-day program. Our results would be similar to what Dr. Patterson mentioned. I think last year on our spring turn, we had around 600 heifers at a 66% fixed time AI. That's the best that we've ever done on large groups. I'm really comfortable with 14-day. I think, though, in our hands, probably any of those programs work if the programs that have been have research behind them and have been approved by the Reproductive Task Force. I think any of those programs work well if they're well executed. But the 14-day fits our management very well. Since we've started using that in the last couple of years, we do sometimes do 5-day as well. After the heifers are AI'd, then about 10 to 14 days later, we put in our cleanup bulls, and then we use a blood test at 30 days to differentiate the AI in bull pregnancies. And then we use ultrasound to confirm before the heifers go to the new owner. They've usually been preg tested once by blood test and usually at least 2 other times prior to departure. We don't let any heifers leave the place that haven't been bred for at least 45 days. But we don't have a production sale. Everything is sold direct from the ranch. And our goal is to move those heifers as quickly as possible to increase their turns, and the quicker their soul will move, the better. But they have to be at least 45 days pregnant before we'll allow them to leave where the shortest bred heifer will be at least 45 days before she leaves.
Dave and Glenn, any other thoughts that you might have, last comments or a take-home message that our viewers and listeners might find important on how they might be able to benefit from either buying or selling a value-added, or Glenn, as you are phrased it, a reduced risk heifer?
Well, I guess from my end here, I think what Glenn's doing, we need more efforts nationwide providing that service, because I think in many respects heifer development from many perspectives, and working with the number of farms and ranches we work with across the country, is one of the things that oftentimes slips through the cracks. And I say that more or less irrespective of size of operation. I'd go back to one of the points I made earlier, in that, many people have the perception that they're doing a good job with their development program, but in many cases they need to make improvements. And so having an opportunity to have individuals like Glenn do what he's doing, I think is really beneficial to the industry. One of the things that I would add relative to what we're working on here is that because of the size of the cow-calf industry in Missouri, University Extension has committed a significant amount of money over the years to really supporting Show Me Select. And one of the things I guess I'm probably as excited about right now relative to where we're at with the program is the fact that Show Me Select and what we've done with the heifer program more or less has taken on a life of its own. And what it's done is, although we have the number of producers that enroll on an annual basis, the steps of the program are being repeated by large number of farms and ranches across the state. All you have to do is talk to either our extension personnel or our veterinarians across the state to really hear and see that. It's created more or less a conduit to integrate or introduce new technology into the industry. I mentioned earlier about the Show Me Plus distinction in terms of the DNA testing. And a year ago at our board meeting, our board meets annually, and we talk about updating the requirements. We do update the requirements on an annual basis with any new information. But a year ago, we began talking about Show Me Plus and the whole genetic profiling of these heifers. And there was very little discussion. This year, we got into a discussion for probably lasted an hour and a half. And really, there's more producers that are beginning interested in using and beginning to try and understand how to use that information in their programs. And I think that's more or less one of the benefits that I see springing from it. 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't have talked about time to AI in these heifers, and now over 90% of the heifers are being not only inseminated, but appointment bred in most cases. The thing that I would add or kind of finish with is that what we're working on right now in terms of enhancing the program is we're working with Method Genetics in St. Joe, Sally Northcutt and Bill Bowman to really upgrade our database. And when I say upgrade it, essentially what they're working with us on is making that database web accessible to where individuals like Glenn could actually access the database, enter all their data into the programs, with the idea that that opportunity be presented to other groups, veterinary clinics, other state extension programs, what have you, around the country. And what's being discussed, and we're hopeful that we can eventually get to that point. And nothing obviously happens overnight. But one of the things in talking with some of the breed associations that there's an interest in is tracking reproductive data, good reproductive data, like we strive for here in our program, very similar to what Glenn's doing, is really hard to come by. It's hard to come by relative to the heifer herself, but also with some of the things that we're doing in terms of, for instance, the timed AI programs, as is the case with what Glenn's doing, understanding how those sires are performing in these timed AI programs and tracking that information over time, I think will become a valuable resource to the industry. So one of the things that's in the discussion phases right now is to actually, if the database is able to be expanded for use outside of Missouri, or even using the data that's generated from here in Missouri alone, is to actually eventually connect that to the breed associations, to where, say for instance, in terms of some of the breed associations, the heifer pregnancy EPDs basically only tell us information relative to whether or not the heifer became pregnant. And we all know that when that heifer becomes pregnant during her first breeding season is really one of the most critical pieces of information, not only during that first breeding season, but also in many cases, it sort of sets a reference point as to a predictor as to how that heifer might perform in subsequent years, because we know those early bred heifers stay in the herd longer. So actually collecting that information in volume and connecting that to the breed associations for a national genetic evaluation on heifers, I think could over time become very valuable to the industry in terms of finally getting us some reproductive data with quality control added to it to where that data becomes much more meaningful over time. So that's probably, I guess, the one other thing that kind of keep on your radar in terms of things that may be coming. But as I pointed out earlier, the neat thing to me about the heifer program is the fact that it has created that conduit for new information, and how producers, once they begin participating, understand how they can actually use pieces of that information to improve what's occurring on their individual operations.
Glenn, any last comments or recommendations to either buyers or sellers of these value-added heifers?
Yes, I have a couple of points I'd like to make. One is from the financial side. I've worked very closely with Dr. Jim McGran, who's a retired economist at Texas A&M, and he's my personal advisor and close friend. And we've looked at our numbers very closely, done a pretty intense enterprise analysis on different aspects of our operation. I think that's an area that really is lacking and needs some improvement. We need to know what these heifers actually cost to raise or purchase on individual operations. And I have a much better handle on what my direct and indirect costs are. We figure in return to operator labor and management. We figure opportunity costs. We truly have some good information. I think there's a real lack of that in the industry, and we need to improve that. Whether you're buying or selling, you need to have that information. So that would be one thing I would certainly recommend, that overlaid over all the improvements reproductively we need to look at on individual operations. Is it cost effective to raise your own heifers versus purchasing those heifers? And I would argue, and I think Dr. McGran would certainly argue, that a lot of small producers would benefit from purchasing bred heifers as opposed to trying to raise their own. And certainly it varies from operation to operation. I guess the next point would be in an operation such as mine that's not in a program, and there's a lot of people out there that are trying to develop heifers. I think it's important that there's transparency and that there's information provided. Not, as I mentioned earlier, not just that they're value added, or not just that they were bred to Cabanese sires, but specifically what Cabanese sires, what was the accuracy level, what specific vaccinations were given. All that information should be available. And I know with our customers, we provide a written contract that describes everything we agreed on, and a pregnancy guarantee that is provided. And if any of the heifers that we sell, if they're checked by their veterinarian within 30 days and there's any difference, then we adjust that accordingly. So I think it's important that that as you get outside of these programs where guidelines are more rigid, and I applaud those, but there's a lot of us out there that are developing heifers, and it's just important that you make sure that you get as much information as possible, and that information has tremendous value.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. That about wraps up this edition of the Beef Roundtable. Bert and I would like to thank Dr. Glenn Rogers and Dr. Dave Patterson for being our guests today. Please join us again next month for another Beef Roundtable discussion.